Hello and welcome to Unstressed. My name is Dr Ron Ehrlich. Well, we are exploring another aspect, another way of switching on the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest. And we're also exploring lessons from the past. These are two themes that I really think I'm really interested in. What can we learn from our past? We've looked at nutrition and gone into what the paleo diet looks at that, but what does a nutrient-dense diet mean in all these different parts of the world? And they're not all paleo, but they're all nutrient-dense. And that's something that we've always had. Were we always eating organic food? No, yeah, well, we were. It was never even an issue until about 50 or 60 years ago. Lessons from the past, our ability to come together as a group, small groups, and how we connect with each other. But today we're going to explore chanting, which has a rich and varied, as you will hear, history. My guest today is Gemma Perry, and Gemma is an academic, well, a researcher anyway, and she's spent the last 10 years of her life at undergraduate, master's, and now PhD level, exploring the power and the physiology behind chanting. And it's a really interesting discussion, which is a theme we're following through in these next couple of weeks. So I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Gemma Perry. Welcome to the show, Gemma.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Gemma, on this program, we have explored meditation and we've explored breathing and we've explored actually also psychedelics, but your interest has been one of chanting. And when I read about that article, and I read it in the Herald a few weeks ago, months ago actually, and I thought, hey, there's my brush with fame, Gemma Perry. So welcome to the show, Gemma. Your interest is in chanting and meditation, but you've kind of made this you've been on an academic journey, a journey of discovery, research, and I thought we might just go back in time a little bit through your research and start at the undergraduate level and work our way through. Tell us where you got started, how you got started.
Yeah, sure. I guess I first got started with my own experiences with chanting, and then also was introduced to it through yoga. So there's a lot of different chanting practices in yoga. But then I started to realize there was sort of chanting in so many different traditions. And so when it came to my honours in psychology, I decided to research, the effects of chanting. So I'm at the Music, Sound and Performance Lab at Macquarie University. So it was, I was able to plug in somewhere and look into the effects of chanting, basically.
Yeah. And you looked at it from the point of view of altruism. Yeah. So just to remind our listener how you defined altruism. What tell us a bit about altruism and then its effect, with chanting.
So altruism is like a selfless concern for others. So we might say that it might be a bit rare in today's world.
What a lovely idea. Sure. What a lovely idea.
It is a lovely idea. And so we had questions, things like, would you give up your seat on a bus? Would you help someone in the street? Would you help your friend move house? These types of things. And we had people chanting in a group. And I'm not sure whether we also might need to define chanting because
go on.
There's so many different, so bring me back if I get carried away.
Yeah, no, go. I love this kind of, it's good to define the terms we're using because we kind of assume everybody knows them. But let's, I think you've kind of given us a clue of altruism and actually something we could all be striving for. So maybe at the end of this, we'll all be chanting. But tell us about chanting too, how we define that.
Yeah, so chanting's used in so many different traditions, I guess, and some people might think that I'm doing like a sort of a bit of a strange PhD, but actually we find chanting in so many cultures around the world. And I guess what's important to define is how we used it in our study as well, because chanting can be used in religious ceremony. It can be used for healing purposes. It can be done in a group, which is what we're looking at, and with the altruism and things like that. And it can also be done individually. So there's also different sounds that can be chanted and different intentions with the sounds. So that all sort of filters down into what we research, and we researched this particular type of chanting, which is I guess we would call it a focused attention meditation. So focused attention meditation is when you use an object or the breath or sound, in the case of chanting, to focus your attention. So we're using it in that context, and we're using it in a group context as well, which is important because this can be also done at home by yourself, and in a temple or on the bus, all that.
It is so interesting, isn't it? Because that's something that I've kind of been fascinated by, and that is lessons from the past. And we kind of we look at nutrition as an example of how have we evolved to be where we're at, and look at the food that has allowed us to do that, to excel as a species. And that's a lesson from the past. And our cultural lessons from the past are about, coping with small tribes of people and how many we can cope with psychologically. But this also goes back through, who knows? How far back are the first recorded chantings? Where were they?
Yeah, well, they're in many traditions.
Yeah.
So we find them in India, and that's where the yoga, Hinduism, and those sorts of types of practice come from. But also in ancient Egypt, they were chanting, and they were chanting to make sure that the Nile would flood. So they actually believed that the chanting would change the environment. It's really quite big.
And even when we think about our own Indigenous people in Australia, which are going back 60, 70, maybe even 80,000 years, and we look at some of their rituals, which they've kind of passed down, the corroboree and all these other passing down of stories. Chanting is also, I think, part of that culture too.
Yeah, absolutely. So they would use chanting to navigate the land as well. And, to navigate the land is really survival. And also this sense of social connection, or the altruism, is like by chanting, you're connecting with your tribe, connecting with the people around you. I think that in some cultures, one of the really terrible, if you did something terrible, you would be penalized by being sent off by yourself, so that social isolation factor. And so that chanting bring people together, and also the navigation of the land, it helps with memory, things like that. If you sing a song over and over again, you're more likely to remember it and know where to find water. And
So that was your undergraduate, but you kind of the effects of chanting on mood and altruism, the results were positive, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So the honours research was we found so first of all, we compared experienced meditators to inexperienced meditators, or chanters, whatever you want to call it, people that had been chanting. And we had two different groups. They were either vocally chanting or silently, we call it silent chanting, but they were listening to a recording. And so we thought that with the vocal chanting, that altruism would increase more because of that higher synchronization. But that actually only happened in the inexperienced meditators. And in the experienced, we found that the altruism increased in both the vocal and the silent. And that sort of makes sense when we look at, like belief systems and things like that, that even just having a shared goal can help people to feel socially connected. So that might have been that sense of connection that they had.
But the non-chanting or non-vocal chanting was still listening to the chanting experience.
Yeah, they were still listening so that we could have the conditions as similar as possible.
Right. Wow. Okay. Because I know, and I mean, the chant that you've focused on, not exclusively, is Om, isn't it? I mean, that's the archetypal chant. If you know, is that what you were using?
Yeah, we used Om in 2 of our studies. And we used Om because it had been used in previous research, and also because it's one of the most widely chanted sounds. So it's used in yoga, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And so you can also feel that it's such a soothing sound. And so we measured stress, like psychological stress, and how that decreased. And that is sort of part of the reason of the sound of the chant. You know, if you're chanting t, that might not be something that's going to reduce your stress. But this that is extending the exhale, and it's engaging the parasympathetic nervous system and helping us to relax. So that's part of it. Yeah.
But that's that level, you dropped that in there with your stress, because that was the next part of your research, wasn't it? Looking at stress. I mean, once you ticked the boxes of mood and altruism, the natural thing was to move on to stress and its effect on the effect of chanting on that. So you found, what'd you come up with on that one?
Yeah, so that one was we had just inexperienced chanters for that one, and we still had the vocal and the silent conditions, and we had them chanting Om again in a group, and we measured both psychological and physiological stress. So we measured cortisol levels in saliva before and after chanting for 12 minutes in a group.
Let's have a look and listen to The Science of Chanting on ABC iView with Gemma Perry.
I went to Macquarie University in Sydney to participate in some group chanting.
So just getting comfortable, relaxed.
They took a sample of my saliva to test levels of the stress hormone cortisol. Okay. And a questionnaire looked at how altruistic and in touch I was with my fellow humans.
So everyone closing the eyes and just feeling as relaxed as you can in this moment.
For the chanting to have any effect, we're going to have to go for around 12 minutes. So please enjoy another 11 and a half minutes of chant. All right, we'll edit it down a little bit. By the end, the group was much more synchronized with our chants.
And whenever you're ready, just opening the eyes again.
One more round of paperwork and a bit more saliva and we're done. But what are the effects?
After the chanting, both your self-report stress and physiological stress, which we measured with the saliva and the cortisol, they also both decreased. It's possible that the increase in social connection is affecting the decrease in stress.
And that decrease in stress is an 18% reduction in cortisol. Impressive.
The Catalyst program, we went to a retirement village actually, and we also measured salivary cortisol, but that was a choir. They had them singing in a choir for a period of six weeks or something like that. So that was on Catalyst, yeah.
Well, why don't we have a look and listen to the choir that's changing lives on ABC Catalyst. It's about a 3-minute clip.
I've invited this aged community in Sydney's east to take part in a 6-week experiment to see if being social can improve their health. Joyce is 90 and was diagnosed with dementia 2 years ago. Although surrounded by people, Joyce often retreats into her own world. Tell me about the singing that you used to do in the past.
I can't remember anything for very long. The doctor said it would be like this, and it is.
Joyce has led a busy life. She loved music and was involved in choirs for decades. But her family noticed she slowly gave up on her social networks as the confusion of dementia began in her late 80s.
I threw all my songs out when I left to come here.
Oh, okay.
And I'm sorry now,
Yeah.
because I didn't think I'd ever sing again.
Yeah. I'm hoping the choir can rekindle Joyce's love of music and help her to socialise again with other people.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you all?
When I last saw Joyce, she thought she'd never sing again. But she's become a well-loved member of the choir. Researchers now believe that music can connect deeply with the brains of people with dementia. So singing, particularly songs from her past, is genuine therapy for Joyce. During this experiment, we've been testing stress levels by measuring the hormone cortisol. My hope was that cortisol levels, and therefore stress levels, would go down over the 6 weeks as people connected and felt less lonely. But did it work? Music psychologist Gemma Perry has the results. So, Gemma, now you were involved with collecting the saliva samples to look at levels of cortisol.
So we tested the saliva before and after the first session of music therapy,
Yeah.
and then before and after 6 weeks. So after the first session, we actually found cortisol increased.
Were you surprised by that?
So it was a new experience for everybody. They didn't know whether it was safe, they didn't know what to expect.
So what did you see in that second?
In the second session.
Yeah.
So overall, we actually noticed at baseline that cortisol was lower before even having that session.
Yeah.
And then after the session, the cortisol was lower again.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is the cortisol levels.
Over the 6 weeks, cortisol levels in our group halved, a sign everyone is feeling much less stressed.
And interesting, considering how much attention aged care facilities have got in this time of our pandemic. And, apart from socially isolating and hygiene, bolstering immune function seems like a really good idea. We haven't heard a lot about that.
Yeah, but you were in a choir or something, you said?
I was,
Yeah.
and that was just the best. I mean, when my kids were at the public school, the local public school, I was president of the P&C, and I decided to, I formed a parent-teacher choir. And so we would meet every Thursday afternoon for an hour, and we sang in a choir. And I learnt the best thing to do was stand next to somebody who could sing really well. And I think it was their resonance in my ear that just made me feel like I was the best singer in the choir.
Isn't it fantastic? Yeah, we've just actually recorded some OMs.
Right.
Totally.
Actually,
that would have been the first time that I've cried on television.
Okay.
So it was just so special to see the effects that this music had on the community, because I was there on day one, and they were doing this experiment of, they had a music therapist come in and they were singing songs. I think it was once a week for 6 to 8 weeks. And we were measuring cortisol at the beginning and then at the end of the 8 weeks. And so even without measuring the cortisol, just watching it, like being there on day one and being there on, 8 weeks later, was just incredible to see. And it really, cortisol decreased, and also there was somebody looking at sleeping patterns, and I can't remember if there was something else. But yeah, people were just really so engaged in the singing, and I don't think immune function was tested, but I'm sure it could be. Yeah.
Well, I think if you're reducing cortisol and you're improving sleep, it sort of is part of that whole picture. So that's an incredible thing. And then you go on to do a PhD. So go on, tell us about your PhD.
Yeah, so The PhD is, obviously we have a little bit more time to look at things, and at the moment we're investigating altered states of consciousness and chanting. So we're also going beyond the Om. So we're asking people from all sorts of different traditions about their belief systems, about their chanting practices, what sort of prayer or sound they're chanting, how they're chanting, whether they're chanting at home or in the office. I think very, very small percent of people chanting in the office. And looking at, mystical states. So altered states of consciousness can be all sorts of different things, but we're particularly interested in mystical states, which is an extreme positive alteration in consciousness. And people often experience unity with the universe, or with other people, or with another object, with nature. And what else happens? Yeah, I think that's...
I mean, you introduced me, when we were talking before, you introduced me to this whole mystical experience idea and questionnaire, actually. So, you know, it kind of looks at 4 different groups, doesn't it? Mystical, the positive mood, transcendence of time and space, and this other word called ineffability.
Yeah, it's an interesting word to describe not being able to describe something in words.
Yeah, because that's what I thought, what does ineffability mean? Well, it's concerned with ideas that cannot or should not be expressed in spoken words or language in general, often being in the form of a taboo or incomprehensible term. So these are the 4 factors in the 30 questionnaire on mystical experience. Wow, I mean, that's just fantastic.
Yeah, so there's those 30 questions, and like you say, it's broken up into those 4 subscales. And then for us to know that someone has had a complete, what they define as a complete mystical experience, they have to have scored over 60% on each of those subscales. So that's how we're sort of defining a mystical experience.
Right. Wow. I mean, I looked at some of the questions, and you know, it was kind of interesting because you're asked to say whether this doesn't happen at all. You're so slight that you can't decide whether it had an effect, a moderate, a strong, etc. Freedom from limitations of your personal self, and a feeling of unity or bond with what was felt to be greater than your personal self. That's question 1. I mean, you know, it's a really interesting thing to look at. What was the outcome? Where were you up to? I know you haven't finished your research yet, but what are we seeing?
So we're still analysing the results from this online chanting survey. I think we've got about 460 participants from different traditions, and we are finding that people experience mystical states in chanting, and they're experiencing them in various traditions. So it's, I guess, then looking at what might be having that effect. And there's things like rhythm and complex rhythmic patterns. So sometimes in some chanting practices, there is not just chanting Om, but there's chanting, there's clapping, and there's stepping. And you're doing this in 3 different rhythms simultaneously. So then we get into states of flow and that kind of thing, which we also have measured, but we're just not in very, very, very rich data set. So we're just not even into analysing the flow states and things like that yet.
But this whole, and it's interesting because I've attended religious services before, and I describe myself as agnostic, and yet I try to understand what the appeal is. And it's not hard to understand, particularly if you go more than a couple of times and you get into the rhythm of what is being said or recited, you get to appreciate, even if you are not a believer of the paternal God, say, you can really feel the appeal. Feel the appeal. That's exactly what you do, isn't it, really?
Yeah, feel the appeal. I mean, I've been kind of lucky, I guess, in the respect that I've been welcomed into many different communities that do these chanting practices, and it's incredible. Like there's definitely something going on, and that's my fascination. Is wait a second. The Buddhists are doing it, the Hindus are doing it, the Muslims are doing it. So is there this underlying current that is, we have these practices that are designed to affect our psychology and physiology, no matter what you believe in. And I think belief systems are fantastic. I think that they can also, the intention that you have with the chanting, and a lot of these belief systems is believing in something greater than the self, which is what takes us back to altruism, or just takes us back to, just not being so selfish all the time, or surrendering to something, just a little bit of humility, or, the belief systems have really got something in them as well. And I think that there is not only a similarity in the practices, but sometimes there's a similarity in the beliefs. So there's a surrender, there's a faith, there's, and these can be channeled into the chanting practices as well. And yet we also see these other systems of chanting that have no belief systems attached to them, and it is purely a mechanical way of getting in touch with rhythm and brain entrainment. And so there's almost two paths, or I'm sure there's many paths, but in what we're talking about here, there's sort of like you can take it with the belief system and maybe a more simplistic chanting practice and just devotion and surrender, and it's not all to me. And then there's this other path that it's such a complex rhythmic, pattern that I'm going to automatically get into a state, an altered state through that as well. Yeah.
And I think there's also, which your first study, which looked at the silent chanters, the fact that they are connected with, the connection with the group, however big that group is, the connection with that group is such a powerful force in us. I mean, we're learning that now more than ever as we socially isolate, aren't we?
Absolutely. And I mean, it's possible that these people are also not only connecting to that group, but they're connecting to a bigger group outside of there. If they have, so for example, in some traditions, there's a particular sound that's chanted. And when somebody engages with chanting that sound, they are aware that so many other people around the world, or, in their community, whether they're in the room with them or not, are also chanting that sound, and that can help them to feel more connected as well.
Mm-hmm. And this idea also of, I love this idea of the chant, the clap, and the foot stamping, because it engages so many different levels of the physical and the mental aspect of it, to bring people in harmony, in unison, if you like, almost. I imagine that is I got to go back into religion, I think.
Absolutely. I'm
definitely chanting.
I'm into all of them. But so this practice with the 3 different rhythms, that's called Takatina, and was designed by a composer. And he's designed this also using sounds by moving his tongue around the mouth. So there's even this kind of tongue articulation that's involved, and stimulating different parts of the palate. And then we have these different rhythms, and I have tried out a lot of these practices, and it's really fascinating. There's also a lot of doing things with the left hand that you're not doing with the right hand, and this simultaneous perception of, like if we think about our minds, and like, I don't know about you, but I wake up thinking and I go to bed.
It's a bad habit.
Thinking.
I've got into these bad habits throughout my life.
Yes.
Yeah.
And when we're focused on all of these different things, we just can't be, we can't be going, oh my gosh, I'm so stressed about what I've got to do tomorrow, and oh my gosh, the state of the world, and we're just so engaged in the task at hand, and that that's helpful. A lot of our mind wandering is not helpful. It's just not. We tend to think that it's important, there's that thought, and let me follow that thought to wherever it's going, and reactions to that thought, and often it's just not that productive. So we're better off just at least some of the time putting our attention into something that's not that.
Well, so much of our life is kind of this balance between being in you mentioned the parasympathetic. So, I know many of our listeners, we've talked about stress. That's what this is about, really. That sympathetic part of the nervous system, which is the fight or flight, and the rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic. I mean, ideally, we should be, for the vast majority of the time, in that parasympathetic mode, shouldn't we? I mean, really.
Yeah, that sounds nice.
Yeah, particularly if we're gonna digest and rest, which make up two pretty important components of our lives. And that's why this chanting, because it also links into some of the work we've done or spoken to people about their breathing, the breathing and the humming, the use of a didgeridoo as an instrument to improve body chemistry, body physiology, and parasympathetic nervous system. So the chanting has just added this other dimension to it, which is so amazing. So what's your routine on a daily basis, Gemma? How are you incorporating this into your life? Healer, how have you healed yourself?
Yeah, well, I guess, like I started these practices because I had terrible mental health issues and was suffering from severe depression. So that was about 12 years ago. And my practice changes for sure. And also it depends if I'm sort of, trying something out and all this kind of thing. But about 12 years ago, I got involved in yoga. So, yoga asana in the West is just the tip of the iceberg. And then the rest of it is really chanting and meditation and all of these types of things. And I got involved in a few different practices. One was a call and response type of chanting, which is called kirtan. And that's when you have a leader chanting, and there's instruments, often a harmonium, which is like a little Indian piano that you pump full of air. And then you have a group of people responding to that chant. So it's also like a little bit conversational. You're also practicing your listening by trying to respond with the same tone and trying to respond in the same sounds essentially as well. Some of the Sanskrit can be complicated, so sometimes you have to really pay attention. So that was a big practice for me. And also ceremonies. So there are some ceremonies that are done with fires, and just group of people chanting the same phrase like 108 times. 108 is generally the number.
Wow.
And I did that, and also started practicing my own individual mantra or phrase, and that's often done with beads. So you have beads and 108 beads, and you count the repetition of the beads. And that's been going on over the years. At the moment, I do a practice that is, I chant, and then I go into a silent type of chanting with the breath. I'm also manipulating the breath, focusing also on different symbols as I'm, so it's breath and mantra, which is the sound. And then after I finish that, then I chant again. And then at nighttime, that's in the morning. And then at nighttime, I also just do a silent chanting practice.
And what would be the length of that morning session and the evening session? What kind?
Yeah, the morning one sounded complicated, didn't it? It's only 20 minutes.
Yeah, no. Well, you can get a lot into 20 minutes, obviously. And and you've kind of wrapped up a whole package of different approaches there based on what you've experienced over time.
Well, I have a teacher.
Ah.
I have a teacher that I've had different practices over the years, but at the moment I'm following this.
What is that practice? Because we've done sessions on Vedic meditation. We've talked about yoga and meditation and how both words really mean connection. But what sort of school of meditation or teacher are you focusing on there?
Yeah, so this particular one is Tantra Yoga.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of the mantra is just, I've been using this word, but mantra is just sound, or, like it's tool for the mind. We often call it mantra in yoga. But a lot of the mantra is part of the Tantra, the tantric traditions. And I mean, mantra is part of many traditions in yoga, but it depends on what people are chanting. So there might be a sort of more classical, like the Yoga Sutras, for example, and that they're chanting. So that's without any deities and things like that. But with Tantra, you have the deities and things, but the deities are seen as a psychological archetype. Like, so they're symbols. And when we come back to this ineffability, I mean, they can be symbols. For me, they're symbols. Not going and having a mystical experience and coming back and not being able to describe it. That's what we have a lot of these symbols for. So we create these psychological archetypes, and they're, Shiva or Shakti, or I'm not sure if you've heard of some of them.
Yeah.
And they can be quite powerful symbols and something tangible for our mind to hold on to, which I think is what chanting is essentially. Meditation can be difficult, but if we have this sound, to keep coming back to a sound can help us to have something to grab hold of,
Mm-hmm.
And same as these deities and these archetypes, and helps with the intention. It's sort of saying we all have these inherent qualities, of Shiva or Shakti or whoever we're chanting to or about, or the sounds, and it's developing those qualities within ourselves. So I do think that, like we say, you are what you eat. I think you are what you chant as well.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think that we have to be careful about, like we have to have good teachers that can guide us with those sorts of things.
And I can see the difference between doing this on your own, or even knowing that others are doing it too, is rather empowering. But this whole idea of surrender and faith, I can see the appeal of having, I'm re-examining now in my own head what I said before about the paternal God. It maybe shouldn't be taken so literally as to kind of use it as an example of sublimating yourself, or seeing that you are just a small speck in the sand of humanity. And that humbling, that's quite a positive thing. I suppose we could all benefit from a lot more of that, really. But that's taking it to another level, isn't it? To look at the history, the sort of faith and traditions that go around it. Just broadens it.
Yeah. I mean, it can be what like I think that many ancient texts have been misinterpreted. Like as soon as I sort of speak words, they've come out of my mouth and they've already been misinterpreted type thing. And we think about all of these texts, and we also have different personalities that connect with different things, and that's why there are 33 million Hindu deities, so we can find one to connect to.
Okay, wow, I didn't even know that.
Well, I think there might be more.
Oh, really? I didn't realize there were that many.
There's a lot.
Wow. Well, I suppose with a population of 1.4 billion, you've got to accommodate all sorts of different interests.
Yeah. But so I mean, I think that there's you can see it how you want to see it, and if that's bringing you some peace and then that's a good thing. And community, so often people are connecting with people that share the same belief systems. But the other thing is, I think, is to also remain humble in that we don't know, like a belief system that says that there is this God and a belief system that says there's no God. They're both just as wild, these claims, and the truth is we don't know. So we need to just remain open to all of the belief systems and the different,
Which makes those 33 million deities almost, that's quite user-friendly because it covers almost every possible, well, it does. I mean, at 33 million, you're covering a few different experiences and options and there as well. And I mean, singing in a choir, sitting in a church, praying. I mean, I went through this with my daughters when my background is Jewish, and I do describe myself as an agnostic Jew. But we did go when my daughters were 12, 13 years old. They're now 34, 31. But we went to synagogue every week.
The Hebrew chanting is beautiful.
It is. And this is what happened to me. You see, I said to my wife, listen, I'm just cannot go to synagogue every week. I'm not that Jewish. Okay. And she said, no, we're going to go. And so we went. And so that meant week after week after week after week, we went. We went on Friday night because it was only a 45-minute service as opposed to Saturday morning, which was 2.5 hours, but we went. And we got to know all of the songs in a way that I had never in all those years before done. And the difference it made to us, we both really enjoyed it. Having said that, as soon as they were bar mitzvahed, we never went back again. And then, all of that. But I got to understand what the appeal was. Yeah. And that appeal of being in a communal space with a shared voice, literally, and doing it together was really lovely. I actually, as I speak to you, and part of this fascination that I've had with what you're doing is bringing that all back for me. I'm kind of thinking, actually, I've got to explore this more, either join a choir or get back to synagogue, even though I'm not a religious person. But
amazing. You don't have to be.
You don't have to be.
That Hebrew chanting just blows me away.
Yes.
Really and truly.
And I remember when I was going through this kind of crisis of faith with myself as my daughter was going through this bat mitzvah, and I was thinking, what the hell am I doing this for? And I went to speak to my rabbi, who's a good friend, who's a friend anyway, so I know him. And I said to him, Jeff, it's Jeff Cammons at the Emmanuel Synagogue in Wallara. And I said, Jeff, I just have a real problem with this Hebrew, I don't even know what I'm saying. I don't even understand the words. And I just have a real problem with this paternal prayer to our Father, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, well, don't take it so literally. What does Om mean? This is what he said to me. He says, what does Om mean? And I go, well, true, and he says, so it doesn't really matter. Don't take it so literally. Yeah. And I think as I reflect on that, particularly as I've been thinking, initially when we first spoke and now again, it's kind of making me reflect on that whole experience in a very different way.
Yeah, wow. And you might be interested in, we spoke about it a little bit last time, in Andrew Newberg's work.
No, go on.
So he's just written a book called The Rabbi's Brain.
Okay.
Yeah, so, and he's just, like if I had a superstar researcher, that's it. And
Andrew Newberg.
Yeah, and he looks at mystical states and neuroscience, so the neurology of the mystical states, and he looks at people like Islamic prayer, sort of praying mechanically and then praying surrendering, and then how these beliefs kind of affect us. He's fantastic, really.
The other part I loved about what we've just been talking about is that you've explored all of these different religions and spiritual practices. And they, because of their messages, have divided countries and people and brought them to war and all these other things. But isn't it so nice that you focus on their similarities? What is it about these religions and all these different faiths and sects that is, what's the common denominator? What draws humans? Chanting. Well, communal prayer or chanting, whatever we call it. Very interesting.
I think, that's what I'm hoping that that's kind of what my research brings is, can we all just be friends because we're all doing the same thing? Yeah. And that's what I hope that it contributes.
Well, focusing on our similarities is definitely something, and actually the fact that you're putting a physiology to it as well, which is, like, where's the science? We often hear, we know things have been good for us for thousands of years, but hey, where's the science? And we've become so preoccupied with where's the science that unless we have that scientific validation, it somehow doesn't have validation.
Yeah, it's such a shame. And I think that that's also where, like, it's important to sort of look at spirituality and science and know where one kind of, no, we can't put everything spiritual into science, but we can have the two of them collide, and both are important. Yeah.
Well, I love the way that you're playing that game. I know chanting's been good for me and I know it's been good for thousands of years, but let's put a bit of science behind it. And hey, lo and behold, you're coming up with it. I just wanted you to take a step back finally from your role as a researcher and as a meditator in yoga, because we're all on this health journey together through life. Well, what do you think the biggest challenge is in our modern world as an individual as we navigate our way through?
Oh gosh, which challenge to choose in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, go on. I'm just interested what you think they might be.
Yeah, I think that, our challenge is relating to ourselves in a positive and a healthy way. And that also is reflecting in the way that we relate to others. And I think that most of the time we don't even know what we're thinking or how, and this is what the meditation practices do, whether it's chanting or mindfulness or, Vedic meditation, is they give us more awareness of our unconscious processes, and that, helps us to relate better to ourselves and, also to other people, I guess. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it did. And I think you've given us something very accessible in chanting, which since we've first talked about this, I've been practicing myself, and I must say it's rather empowering and enjoyable. And so thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm glad to hear that you've been practicing.
I have been. You've inspired me. Thanks, Gemma.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
So there it is. I'm just fascinated by all these different ways into our nervous system. And as I was saying to Gemma, what we have become so preoccupied with the science. Everything has to be proven in a randomized control or some kind of a study to validate what we've known for thousands of years has been an important part of our culture. And again, looking at connections, not just connections to ourselves, not just connections to our brain, to our thoughts, to our breath, to our nervous system, to our immune function, I could go on, but connections to others, connections to a broader community within the world, and connections to our own place in human history. I mean, this is what I find so fascinating about this particular subject, but also lessons from the past. So we're going to have links to those, the iView program and the Catalyst program. I think, as I said, having sung in a choir, it's such an uplifting experience. Having sat in a church or a synagogue for myself, that is, I'm going to revisit that now, because it's a whole different perspective about surrender and faith and connection, and a lot there for me to think about, and I hope it's been the same for you. Listen, we've got some great programs we're developing online. There's so many exciting things happening. Don't forget to download the app, Unstress with Dr. Ron Ehrlich. That's how you search it on the iTunes App Store or in Google Play, Unstress with Dr. Ron Ehrlich. And that's going to be really important as we emerge from this very challenging year 2020, and we're looking forward to a great year next year in 2021, and we've got some exciting things planned then. So I hope this finds you well. Until then, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences and conclusions.